The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete barriers of New Haven, the fortified compound that had become humanity's last stronghold in the wasteland of what was once Pennsylvania. Colonel Marcus Rivera stood atop the 20-foot wall, his weathered hands gripping the binoculars as he surveyed the perimeter for the 100th time that week, his military bearing unchanged despite 3 years of defending against the relentless tide of the infected. Below in the compound's center, Dr. Sarah Chun emerged from the converted laboratory that had once been a school gymnasium, her white coat stained with the evidence of another sleepless night, spent analyzing tissue samples and searching for answers that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. The 200 survivors who called New Haven home were beginning their daily routines, tending to the vegetable gardens carved out between reinforced buildings, maintaining the solar panels that provided their power, and checking the electrified fences that hummed with deadly current, all while the ever-present sound of distant moaning reminded them that death lurked just beyond their walls. Jake Morrison secured his rifle across his back and approached the main gate where his 3-person scouting team waited, their faces grim with the knowledge that each venture outside the walls might be their last, but someone had to monitor the infected populations and search for supplies that grew scarcer with each passing month. The massive steel doors, reinforced with layers of welded metal and concrete, groaned open just wide enough for the team to slip through before sealing again with a finality that always made Jake's stomach tighten, knowing that if something went wrong out there, those doors might never open for them again. They moved silently through the cleared zone that extended 50 yards from the walls, past the maze of razor wire and pit traps, past the skeletal remains of infected that had tested their defenses over the months, their bones bleached white, under the unforgiving sun and serving as a grim reminder of what awaited anyone who let their guard down for even a moment. 5 miles east of the compound, Jake's team crested a hill and froze at what they saw in the valley below, a sight that defied everything they thought they knew about the infected and sent ice water coursing through their veins. Thousands upon thousands of zombies moved through the abandoned suburbs with a coordination that should have been impossible. Not the typical mindless shambling they had grown accustomed to, but organized movement with purpose and direction that spoke of an intelligence that shouldn't exist in the rotting minds of the undead. At the center of this massive horde, Jake could see figures that moved differently from the rest, infected that still retained enough of their human form to be recognizable as individuals, but whose eyes burned with an alien intelligence that made his skin crawl as they gestured and directed the masses around them like generals commanding an army. The scout team exchanged horrified glances as they realized the implications of what they were witnessing, understanding that their carefully constructed defenses had been built to repel mindless hordes, not tactical strikes coordinated by thinking. Enemies who could adapt and plan and learn from their mistakes. Jake pulled out his radio with trembling fingers and whispered the code phrase that would send New Haven into immediate lockdown, his voice barely audible as he described the approaching threat and estimated their arrival time at less than 6 hours, knowing that the information he was transmitting would shatter the fragile sense of security that had kept the survivors sane for 3 long years. As emergency sirens began to wail across the compound, cutting through the morning air like knives and sending children crying into their parents' arms, Colonel Rivera barked orders to his security teams while Dr. Chun rushed to secure her research. Both leaders understanding that everything they had built, every life they had sworn to protect, now hung in the balance against an enemy that had evolved beyond their worst nightmares. The walls that had seemed so impregnable just hours before now felt like nothing more than a paper barrier against the storm that was coming. And as Jake's team began their desperate race back to the compound, they could hear the distant sound of the horde beginning to move with increased urgency, as if those burning eyes had somehow detected their presence and marked New Haven as the next target in their inexorable march across the devastated landscape. The age of hiding behind walls was about to end, and the survivors would soon learn whether their refusal to surrender to despair would be enough to carry them through the darkness that was descending upon their sanctuary. Dr. Sarah Chun's hands trembled as she adjusted the microscope lens for the third time in 10 minutes, her exhausted eyes straining to focus on the tissue sample that Jake's team had managed to retrieve from one of the evolved infected during their harrowing escape back to New Haven. And what she saw defied every piece of research she had conducted over the past 3 years since the outbreak began. The viral structures within the cells showed signs of deliberate mutation, not the random genetic drift she had expected, but organized changes that suggested the pathogen was actively rewriting the neural pathways of its hosts while preserving specific cognitive functions that would benefit the collective survival of the infected population. Colonel Rivera paced behind her in the makeshift laboratory, his combat boots echoing against the concrete floor as he struggled to comprehend the implications of her findings, knowing that everything they had learned about fighting the infected would now have to be reconsidered in light of this new intelligence that could predict their defensive strategies and adapt accordingly. Through the reinforced windows of the lab, they could see the compound's 200 survivors moving with barely controlled panic as they prepared for the approaching horde. Families clutching their meager possessions while maintenance crews worked frantically to strengthen barricades that might prove useless against an enemy that could think and plan and coordinate attacks with military precision. Vincent Torres, the compound's head of security, burst through the laboratory doors with 3 of his most trusted men behind him, his face flushed with anger and fear as he confronted the leadership with a proposal that would split the community down the middle and challenge everything they had built together over 3 years of shared struggle and sacrifice. Torres argued that New Haven had become a death trap, that their walls and defenses were designed to contain mindless zombies, not tactical threats that could study their weaknesses and exploit them systematically, and that their only chance of survival lay in immediate evacuation before the horde arrived and turned their sanctuary into their tomb. The debate that followed grew increasingly heated as other survivors gathered around the laboratory, voices rising in anger and desperation as the community that had stood united against the infected began to fracture under the pressure of an impossible choice between the security of known walls and the terror of unknown territory beyond their protected borders. Dr. Chun tried to maintain focus on her research while the argument raged around her, knowing that understanding the viral evolution might provide them with tactical advantages, but Torres dismissed her scientific approach as wishful thinking that would get them all killed when the intelligent infected arrived with strategies specifically designed to breach their defenses. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison and his scouting team established observation posts along the compound's perimeter, their binoculars trained on the eastern horizon where dust clouds marked the steady approach of the massive horde. And through their scopes they could see the alpha infected moving among the masses like shepherds, guiding their flock, occasionally stopping to examine the terrain and point toward New Haven, with gestures that suggested they were already planning their assault. The first probing attack came at sunset, not the mindless charge they had expected, but a carefully coordinated test of their defenses as small groups of infected approached different sections of the wall simultaneously, forcing the defenders to spread their limited ammunition and manpower while the alphas observed from a distance and took note of response times, weapon placements, and tactical vulnerabilities. Colonel Rivera realized with growing horror that the infected were learning from each probe, adjusting their approach based on the defenders' reactions, and that each test brought them closer to finding the weakness that would allow them to breach the walls that had protected New Haven for so long. As night fell and the compound's floodlights illuminated the perimeter in harsh white light, families huddled together in their quarters while armed guards took positions along the walls, everyone knowing that the systematic probing attacks were just the beginning of a siege that would test not only their defenses, but their unity, as a community facing an enemy that could think plan, and adapt faster than they had ever imagined possible. Dr. Chun worked through the night, her research taking on desperate urgency as she searched for any weakness in the viral structure that might give them an advantage, while Torres continued to argue for evacuation with increasing numbers of supporters who believed that staying in New Haven meant certain death at the hands of an enemy that had evolved beyond their ability to fight. The sound of infected testing the electrified fences echoed through the compound like a deadly countdown, each probe teaching the Alphas more about their defenses while the survivors faced the terrible realization that their impregnable fortress might have become their prison, and that the intelligence behind the dead was far more dangerous than the mindless hunger. They had learned to fight over 3 years of desperate survival in a world that no longer belonged to the living. The compound's main generator died at exactly 3 in the morning, plunging New Haven into darkness just as the Alpha-led infected launched their most coordinated assault yet. And Jake Morrison knew with cold certainty that the timing was no coincidence as he stumbled through the pitch-black corridors toward the emergency power station, while the sound of the electrified fence-going silence sent chills down his spine. Emergency lighting flickered to life after precious minutes that felt like hours, revealing the horrifying sight of infected scaling the now powerless fence while defenders scrambled to their positions. But what truly terrified Jake was the discovery of fresh wire cuts in the generator room that showed signs of deliberate sabotage rather than mechanical failure or battle damage. Colonel Rivera's voice crackled over the radio system as he coordinated the defense from the command center, his military training evident in the calm precision of his orders. But even his steady leadership couldn't hide the growing panic in his voice as he realized that someone within their own walls had betrayed them at the moment of their greatest vulnerability. The backup generators roared to life just in time to prevent a complete breach, sending electricity surging through the fence and throwing back the climbing infected in showers of sparks. But the damage to the community's trust had already been done as survivors looked at their neighbors with suspicion and fear, wondering who among them had chosen to side with the enemy when their lives hung in the balance. Dr. Chun emerged from her laboratory with a laptop clutched to her chest, her research data secured, but her face pale with the realization that the saboteur had also attempted to destroy her viral samples, suggesting that whoever was working against them understood the strategic value of her scientific work and wanted to prevent any breakthrough that might give the survivors an advantage against the evolved infected. Vincent Torres took charge of the investigation with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had spent years in corporate security before the outbreak, his team conducting searches of personal quarters and questioning anyone who had access to the critical systems. But the process of hunting for traitors within their own ranks created an atmosphere of paranoia that threatened to tear the community apart from within. Jake found himself assigned to guard duty on the eastern wall, where he could observe the infected horde maintaining their positions just beyond rifle range. And through his night vision scope, he watched the Alpha infected moving among their masses with what appeared to be tactical radios, coordinating their movements with technology that shouldn't exist in the rotting hands of the undead. The morning brought new horrors as maintenance crews discovered that someone had been systematically weakening the wall's foundation over several weeks, using tools from the compound's own workshop to create stress fractures that would cause catastrophic failure under sustained assault. And the revelation that the sabotage had been planned for weeks rather than days suggested a level of betrayal that shook even the most hardened survivors. Trust evaporated like morning mist as neighbors who had shared meals and protected each other's children now watched each other with haunted eyes, every conversation becoming a potential interrogation, every gesture analyzed for signs of treachery. While the infected waited beyond the walls like wolves sensing the weakness of a divided pack, Dr. Chun's continued research revealed that the Alpha infected possessed communication abilities that extended far beyond simple gestures. Their evolved neural pathways allowing them to coordinate complex strategies across vast distances, and she began to suspect that the saboteur might be receiving direct instructions from the enemy forces that surrounded them. The compound's supply inventory showed disturbing discrepancies that painted a picture of systematic theft over months, with medical supplies, ammunition, and food disappearing in quantities that suggested someone was either hoarding resources for a personal escape or providing aid to forces outside the walls. And the discovery that the missing items included radio components sent ice through the hearts of the leadership team. Jake volunteered to conduct a dangerous reconnaissance mission beyond the walls, using the compound's underground maintenance tunnels to emerge outside the perimeter and observe the infected encampment. But what he discovered there defied his worst fears as he watched human figures moving freely among the alpha infected, apparently immune to attack and engaged in what appeared to be collaborative planning sessions. The radio intercepts that Dr. Chun's hastily assembled monitoring equipment captured revealed fragmentary conversations, inhuman voices discussing breach points, defensive weaknesses, and optimal timing for the final assault, confirming that the sabotage was part of a coordinated effort between human collaborators and the Evolved, infected to destroy New Haven from both outside and within. As Jake made his way back through the tunnels with this devastating intelligence, he realized that the community's survival depended not only on defending against the external threat, but on identifying and stopping the traitors who had turned their sanctuary into a trap, and that the next 24 hours would determine whether the bonds of trust and cooperation that had sustained them through 3 years of horror would prove stronger than the fear and suspicion that now poisoned every interaction between the survivors. The infected pressed closer to the walls, as if sensing the internal discord, their coordination becoming more sophisticated with each passing hour. While inside the compound, families armed themselves against their own neighbors, and the very foundations of their society crumbled under the weight of betrayal, leaving Jake to wonder if they would destroy themselves from within before the enemy ever had a chance to breach their defenses and complete the work that human treachery had begun. The emergency council meeting in New Haven's command center erupted into chaos as Jake Morrison's reconnaissance report confirmed their worst fears about human collaboration with the Alpha infected, and the terrible knowledge that they faced. Enemies both outside and within their walls shattered the last remnants of unity that had held the community together through 3 years of desperate survival. Colonel Rivera stood at the head of the conference table, his military bearing, unable to mask the exhaustion and despair that had settled into his weathered features as he studied the compound's resource inventory and acknowledged what everyone already knew but no one wanted to say aloud. They had perhaps 48 hours of ammunition remaining and food supplies that would last less than a week under siege conditions. Dr. Sarah Chun clutched her latest research findings with hands that trembled from exhaustion and caffeine, her scientific mind racing through calculations that all led to the same inevitable conclusion. The viral evolution they were witnessing represented an extinction-level adaptation that would spread across the remaining human population unless they could find a way to develop countermeasures. But her laboratory lacked the resources and time needed for the breakthrough that might save not just New Haven, but humanity itself. Vincent Torres had abandoned all pretense of diplomatic discussion as he paced behind the assembled survivors, his security team flanking the exits while he presented satellite images and radio intercepts that painted a terrifying picture of infected populations converging on their location from multiple directions, transforming their siege into an encirclement that would make escape increasingly impossible with each passing hour. The revelation that infected scouts had been mapping their underground tunnel system sent shockwaves through the leadership as they realized that even their emergency evacuation routes had been compromised by an enemy that possessed both human intelligence and inhuman patience, methodically closing off every avenue of retreat while tightening the noose around their sanctuary. Jake's scouting team had discovered evidence of a potential safe haven 50 miles to the north, an abandoned military research facility called Echo base that appeared to be heavily fortified and possibly still defended by automated systems. But reaching it would require traveling through the heart of infected territory, during daylight hours when the Alpha-controlled hordes could coordinate massive pursuit operations. The compound's vehicle inventory revealed the cruel mathematics of survival. They possessed 3 armored personnel carriers and 2 supply trucks capable of carrying perhaps 60 people total. But evacuating everyone would require multiple trips through increasingly dangerous territory, or the unthinkable choice of leaving some survivors behind to maintain the compound's defenses while others attempted escape. Dr. Chun interrupted the evacuation debate with a discovery that changed everything: her analysis of intercepted radio. Communications revealed that the infected were not just coordinating their assault on New Haven, but were simultaneously attacking survivor enclaves across the entire eastern seaboard, suggesting that the Alpha-infected possessed a hive-mind intelligence that extended far beyond individual communities and was orchestrating a systematic extermination campaign against the remaining human population. The weight of this revelation settled over the council like a funeral shroud as they realized that New Haven was not just fighting for their own survival, but potentially represented one of the last functional research facilities capable of developing a defense against the viral evolution that threatened to complete humanity's extinction within months rather than years. Colonel Rivera's military experience told him that defending a compromised position against overwhelming odds was tactical suicide, but his conscience rebelled against abandoning the research that might save the species, creating an impossible choice between immediate survival and long-term hope that tore at his soul like nothing he had experienced even during the worst battles of his military career. The community fractured into 3 distinct factions as the debate raged through the night. Torres led those who demanded immediate evacuation regardless of the risks, arguing that staying meant certain death and that the living had a responsibility to preserve themselves even if it meant abandoning their research and their weaker members. A second group rallied around Colonel Rivera's position that they should remain and fight, using New Haven's defenses to buy time for Dr. Chin's research, while sending small teams to establish communication with other survivor communities. The third faction, led by Jake Morrison, proposed a desperate compromise that would split their forces, sending the strongest fighters to escort the vulnerable civilians toward Echo Base, while a skeleton crew remained behind to defend the laboratory and continue the vital research until the last possible moment. The infected seemed to sense their internal division as the probing attacks intensified throughout the night. Alpha-led groups testing different sections of the perimeter simultaneously, while human collaborators provided intelligence about the compound's weaknesses, forcing the defenders to spread their dwindling ammunition across multiple threat vectors while exhaustion took its toll on their accuracy and reaction times. Dr. Chun worked feverishly in her laboratory as the debate continued, knowing that every hour brought them closer to either breakthrough or annihilation, her research revealing tantalizing hints about the viral structure that suggested a possible weakness in the Alpha-infected's enhanced intelligence, but requiring additional time and resources that they simply did not possess under siege conditions. As dawn approached and the infected horde shifted into attack formations that clearly indicated the final assault would begin within hours, the 3 faction leaders stood in the command center, facing a choice that would determine not only their own fates but potentially the future of human civilization. Stay together and fight a battle they could not win, split their forces and risk failing at both evacuation and defense, or abandon everything they had built in a desperate flight toward an uncertain sanctuary that might already be overrun by the very enemies they sought to escape. The sound of the compound's outer defenses beginning to buckle under sustained assault echoed through the corridors as families gathered their few possessions and said goodbye to neighbors they might never see again, while the leadership team prepared to implement a decision that would forever define whether humanity's last stand would be remembered as a heroic sacrifice or a tragic waste of the species' final hope for survival against an enemy that had evolved beyond their wildest nightmares and showed no mercy for the civilization that had once ruled the earth.